All right, so let's talk about this myth situation that ASE has. Common myths. I mean, ASE has been around now for basically 45 years this month. It makes it. We are, mostly known for doing ASE testing and certification. And of course, doing that for as many years as we have, there have been numerous myths that have popped up over the years. And so we'd like to explore some of that tonight. Okay, so what is a myth? Myth is a widely held but false idea or belief. And I mean, obviously there's shows like Mythbusters and all kinds of other shows that are out there, and documents that get into these things, because sometimes when a myth is perpetuated long enough, it's almost understood to be fact. Well, obviously that can be a troubling thing, because a lot of things, just because they've gone on for a long time, don't make them accurate. Okay, so let's take a look at this first perception of ASE's sole purpose being testing and certification. And is this a myth or fact? So let's go over to Dan and see what Dan's input is on this.
Thank you, Dave. So ASE is more than a testing and measurement contractor that manages the bar exam for service professionals like you working in our trade. The ASE is a family of organizations, and it includes NATEF, which is charged with management of an accreditation program for secondary and post-secondary education programs focused on automobile, medium-heavy truck, and collision repair. There are approximately 2,300 schools currently accredited. NATEF coordinates trade and educational community support of standards set by these same stakeholders. Included in this support is a series of tests that can be used to evaluate students against a bar set by educators. Similar to the automotive tests, students have their own credential as well. Tens of thousands of students participate in that each year, and NATEF also hosts an annual instructor education conference that's strongly supported by vehicle manufacturers, equipment manufacturers, and training providers. Attendance is nearly 400 per year. So that part of the organization handles the credentialing or accreditation of the schools. Then there's AES, a component of that manages a mentorship program that merges both students' needs for mentoring and on-the-job reinforcement of school-based instruction with the employer's need for qualified staff. So employer participation requires a mentor to go through a process of training. Then there's ATMC, the Automotive Training Managers Council. This organization provides mechanisms for automotive training managers to network, share, and collaborate in design, delivery, assessment, and other solutions for education and training of service professionals like you. ATMC hosts an annual conference with about 200 participants, including OEM, parts suppliers, manufacturers, training developers, software providers, and then independent training providers. They also have an annual survey they call the Annual Benchmark Training Survey that's hosted by ASE. The ATMC manages another program called CASE. That is an ASE accreditation for continuing education training providers producing content for service professionals in our trade, folks like you. Participation in the program requires key elements of assessment, including evaluating achievement of the training objectives for the course or the class or seminar or presentation. So those organizations work hard to bring potential employees and provide solutions. They're bringing new employees into the field and then provide solutions for fostering the growth of us as service professionals that are currently working in our trade. And then so this is myth that ASE is focused primarily on testing is not necessarily true.
Okay, Dan, let me jump in here a little bit. I'll add a little bit to this. I don't have any questions coming in the questions panel yet, but I did want to talk a little bit about these organizations. I guess it's also important to understand a little bit of the details about each organization, that they are separate 501c3 organizations. They each have their own board of directors made up of stakeholders from the segments of the industry that are appropriate for it, and so they're all somewhat organized under this umbrella, the Industry Education Alliance, hosted and organized by ASE. So this way they can work together and coordinate and try to minimize overlap, but of course there is still a lot of overlap with these organizations. But I say the key thing, I guess, is that they are all independently driven, but they are all related under ASE. What we can do, we do have some hands raised, but let's see if we have any questions specific to this alliance. Dave, you have anything on that?
I don't. Do you want to try a couple of the hands in the audience there?
Let me ask if anyone would like to chime in on the about the ASE organization or whatever. Why don't you send a question in through the question pane real quick so we can stay on this particular topic, and we'll answer some of the raised hands here in a little bit once we get a little deeper into it, I'd suggest.
Okay, the only other thing I'm going to add to this, Don, is that this is very much everything here with the organizations, the family of organizations, is in the spirit of the founding originally of ASE, of being, you know, bigger than just the testing part. Okay, so with that, what we've learned is that it's not ASE's sole purpose for testing and certification. Sure, it's a big part of what we do, but that is a myth. Okay, so let's take a look at another perception. This is a common one that we hear very often, is that the ASE staff writes test questions. It could be everything from visions of people in white lab coats, you know, going through shop manuals and things like that, and coming up with questions that we put out to the industry. And Dan, over to you.
Thanks, Dave. ASE staff facilitates workshops for the writing, review, and approval of test questions. In those workshops, working service professionals are contracted to write those questions. Support included in those workshops comes from representatives of the manufacturers. Most manufacturers are representing. They rotate through as space allows, and very strong support from them on a regular basis. And then we also contract with folks from independent facilities, as well as folks that are working as technicians in manufactured franchise facilities. When they write a question, it is written specifically to the task list or job description in the ASE study guides. So part of the workshop's responsibility, those participants, is to review the task list for the tests that they are writing for, and make sure that those tasks are up to date and current to the role of a technician that is performing those tasks in a service bay. And then they're also go through and make sure that the content areas are correct for those same tasks. Once the tasks are written and approved, then the service professionals can write questions to a specific task using their work experience, training information, service information to come up with content. Then they're handed to us at the front of the room, and we edit them for grammar and syntax and spelling, and we return them back to the group in booklet format, and then they review those questions, read through them, make notes on them, and then we discuss each question. If a question needs modification, maybe there's more than one correct answer as it's written. Maybe there's 3 correct answers that could cause that. They write distractors or incorrect answer options to help make that question so that absolutely only one answer is correct. Once they're approved, then we bring them back to ASE to be pre-tested on the exams.
Okay, Don, do you have anything to add to that?
You know, I'm looking through the questions, and one question similar to this, it's actually stepping back a little bit, and that was whether or not there are any experts, subject matter experts, that are working in the field on the advisory boards for any of those organizations. There's NATEF, ATMC, and the ASE board and such. And the answer to that is absolutely yes. Just like the workshop Dan was describing, the board of directors is made up of a cross-section of the industry. Speaking specifically to the ASE board for a minute, there are a certain number of seats that are designated to each category. So there are working technicians from dealerships, from independent shops and such. There are representatives from OEs and dealer principals and things like that. So there's a cross-section of representation on the boards, just as well as in these workshops. Of course, they're all subject matter experts. They're not necessarily policy experts, or they aren't policy experts or anything like that. But like I say, it's a related question, but backing this up a little bit more.
I'd also like to jump in just for a second and talk about when the questions are written. ASE tests are bar exams, so they have a specific level of difficulty that's set by, again, a committee of working service professionals. They set the bar on where the difficulty should be on that exam, the cut score, so to speak. So in our case, it turns into the number of questions correct on that exam to pass the test. In order for a question that's written in a workshop to be used on a test, it has to be pre-tested to determine its statistical analysis, how well it functions as a test question, how well it differentiates a less than knowledgeable from a knowledgeable test taker, as well as how difficult it is in general in the population. So that has to happen before any item is brought into the test. Thanks, John, for that question.
Okay, anything else, Don, before we move on?
Maybe a little bit out of sequence here. There's one gentleman was asking about the test questions in Spanish or other languages. Again, a little bit off topic, but ASE currently does not offer the test in a multilingual format and really doesn't have any plans currently to do so. And not saying that it won't happen in the future, but right now we don't have that.
I know that we have at least one attendee tonight that's actually been a participant at a workshop. Do we want to go ahead and let him give a comment on his experience and how that actually works from a participant's point of view?
Dave, let me jump in there and track him down here. I'll open up a mic for one of them there. Can you hear me, Matt?
I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. So could you give us a little bit of a perspective of what happens in the workshop?
It happens pretty much exactly as you illustrated. A group of us representing different areas of the trade. Some are dealership technicians, independent technicians, manufacturing or manufacturer trainers. We work on a task list, update it, modify it if it required to have it reflect modern vehicles, and then we write questions to specific areas in that task list, and we shoot for difficulties in that area that is set by the board for us. And sometimes we're a little on the difficult side, and sometimes we're a little on the not so difficult side, but the pre-testing kind of helps filter that out for us and get us where we need to be.
Thank you, Matt. One common thing we notice in the workshop when we write a test question, until the statistical analysis comes back, it's difficult to predict how well that question will perform. Some things might consider to be very industry standard, so to speak. A question might fit what we consider to be a very common scenario, and that might come back as too difficult or too easy to use on a test. So it's very important to know that information. Dave, I recognize the name of another person on this list here. I'm going to open the mic up for Leo. Leo's a recent participant. Leo, if you get a chance, go ahead and unmute your mic. There you go.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. Can you hear me?
You bet.
All right. Well, yeah. I mean, I was recently on a panel, and it's a pretty great experience putting these questions together, because it's not just people throwing stuff from the hip. You're really putting a lot of time and effort into what's in the task list and how you write the questions to reflect the tasks. And probably the most eye-opening part is, as you mentioned, the statistical analysis that goes in afterwards. It's not as though these questions just get written and thrown on the test and then everybody's at their mercy. What happens with these questions really gets analyzed as far as their effectiveness and whether or not they're a good question, how they survive in the field. So that's a pretty eye-opening part of the whole process.
All right, anything else before we move along?
Dave, there was one good question on here about the student certification exams, whether or not they use the same questions as the professional level. And I responded privately, but to everyone here, it might be helpful to know that for the student cert, the process is the same. In other words, you still bring in a workshop group like this, go through the statistical validation processes and so on, and the industry drives the content. The big difference, of course, is the target audience, is that for the students, they don't have experience yet, so the questions are written with that in mind. Also, in those tests, there will be some theory-based questions where you won't see that on a professional level exam. And of course, the cut scores and such and stats are developed based upon, again, the target population. But similar process, just different target. Great, thanks.
Saw a bunch of other folks on the webinar that have participated in workshops. I want to thank them for attending tonight, and I can't get to all of you, but I really appreciate your support, and so does the industry. So thank you very much. And Leo, thanks for your comments. I forgot to turn my mic on when I was turning yours off. Again, the pretest items happen on the ASE tests for the full-length exams. There's always 10 on those tests, and then the recertifications, we don't use those on there. So thank you very much. Dave?
All right, thank you, Don and Dan and Leo and Matt and everybody else. Appreciate the insight from your all different perspectives. Okay, so what we've learned is that as far as ASE staff writing the ASE test questions, that is a myth. Okay, moving on. And this is one that we've gotten a little bit of comment in the questions pane, is that the questions are tricky, so on and so forth. So ASE tests rely on tricky questions to fool you. We know that that's a perception that's out there. Is that a myth or a fact? Okay, Dan.
Thank you, Dave. The ASE test on every ASE test question, there's absolutely only one correct answer, okay? And we make sure of that in the workshops using the subject matter experts, backing it up with pre-testing, and then review on a regular basis by those workshops. So that's very important to recognize that there's only one correct answer. It's not, I'm not going to use the name of the game show, but it's not a game show, and the game show host used to say, okay, we have 100 technicians surveyed and the top 4 answers are on the board. It's not like that, okay? There's only one correct answer. If you think there are always 2 or more correct, okay, that's a test question you need to pay close attention to, because that's really telling you that you may not be as knowledgeable as you think you are, and that is why the test is difficult for you to pass. Those are the items that you need to pay very close attention to. So the ASE test questions are real-world scenarios that technicians in almost any service bay across the country should be bumping into. It may not be on a daily basis, but it should be something you bump into in your work experience. So the other thing about trickiness is sometimes you consider them to be tricky because of language. we use the 5th grade, or the items are written to the 5th grade reading level on the regular test, and then on the advanced level test, they're migrating up into the 9th grade reading level. There's a composite vehicle booklet like with L1, so service information from most manufacturers is written to a much higher level, reading level. So sometimes tricky is a situation that becomes, it's caused maybe by you. You might read too much into a test question. You're not taking the test question for face value, so that can be a distinct problem. So you need to step back and think, this is a snapshot at a moment in time in the analysis of this vehicle, and make decisions based on the information, because all of the information you need to answer that question is in the stem of the question and the answer options. While there may be other things that cause it outside of the 4 answers that are given, there are there's absolutely just one answer there listed that is correct. Let's take a look now at Tech A, Tech B questions. So Tech A, Tech B questions, it's often thought that these are the ASE bread and butter questions. They're actually not. We limit the number of Tech A, Tech B questions down to around 25% of the test. Tech A, Tech B questions are 2 true-false questions married together to come up with 4 answer options that never ever change. A only, B only, both A and B, and neither A nor B. So when you read a Tech A, Tech B question, focus on Tech A's statement, make a decision if that statement is true or false. Then read Tech B's statement and make a decision whether that statement is true or false. And then once you know your answer, then select that from the 4 answer options again that never change. These 2 statements are independent of each other. They don't build on each other. There's some, we work very, very hard with the workshop groups to build really good questions. Some of the test preparation questions maybe not as polished as the ASE test questions. Don't lump those questions in with the stuff you see on the test. They're not the same thing. They work very hard to make sure these test questions do a really good job of determining whether you're knowledgeable or not about that subject.
Okay, Don, over to you.
Yeah, Dan, we have a few good questions here that I think you'd like to respond to. One is about the task list. Again, maybe if I can get you to revisit that, emphasize that what we do with the task list at each of the workshops, and also how they're modified and such.
Sure. The task lists are updated every time the workshop meets to perform question writing. They have to review the task list and make sure that it meets what's happening in service bays and is applicable to vehicles that are between 5 and 10 years old, or the technology on vehicles that are between 5 and 10 years old. This way, we do not disadvantage technicians that are working on the latest models, and we do not disadvantage technicians who are working on models that are older. Those technologies have to be prevalent in service bays across the country. So that's really key. So from that, if you think about it, I say this a lot, but we have not had carburetors, distributors. We don't have systems that we rebuild in the hydraulic area, such as the wheel cylinders, master cylinders, or brake calipers. That content has been removed from the tests in the test questions. It also has been removed from the tests in the task list, so we don't reference them in the task list anymore. So you won't see those type of items. The test questions then, like that we were talking about pre-testing, we would be pre-testing items that maybe dealt with stability control, traction control, intervention systems. Those questions get pre-tested and pulled into the test form once they're approved by the workshop committees and the statistical analysis. So that's important. There's also industry standards that we follow. For instance, we use the SAE documentation for definitions of items, the terminology used for items, the code descriptions for items. We focus on that so that we don't disadvantage any technicians that are coming with their specific knowledge base to calling something where an example is in steering column coupler might be called a rag joint in slang term, or even at some manufacturer, but that coupler might have an SAE description, and that's what we focus on in our tests. And it's also in the also very important to use terminology that is common throughout each of the test platforms. So for instance, truck, transit bus, school bus, those terminology tends to stay the same for the common items. Automobile, same idea.
All right, Don, any more insight there?
You know, I'd like to tag team on this a little bit too, just follow up on some of this question. Is that, you know, I think there's a lot of concern still about how do we really know that there's only one correct answer in here. Again, without getting too much in the details, the statistical analysis is really what helps to validate this. Not only does that workshop that Dan was describing and showing a photo of, not only do all those SMEs in the workshop agree that there's only one correct answer with this, but then the statistics bear that out. When you get 5,000, 10,000 people taking a test, and you can analyze this several different ways, and so they're the ones that really put the final stamp of approval on whether or not what this group of SMEs in a workshop said is actually correct. So there's, when I say without getting into too many details, there's a tremendous amount of work that goes behind the scenes statistically to prove this out for us. And also there's a lot of effort to try to make sure that it's not unfairly disadvantaging one particular segment of the industry or another, or even perhaps gender or age or things like this. So there's a lot of analysis that just goes in to help validate this. Great. Thank you.
Dan, any final comments on that?
There was a Tim had asked about the electrical diagrams written and labeled in a standard SAE format. The diagrams that we use are inspired by whoever writes them, okay? So if a person from Toyota sees a problem in the service bay and they say, you know, this was interesting for me. It had mechanical control or electrical control of the retractable portion of the mirror, and then it has logic control of the up-down, left-right portion of the mirror. How that's a interesting concept. So they write a question to that, and then we modify their wiring schematic to remove like any information that really makes it difficult to read. So the wiring schematics become more generic. So wire colors are removed, the pin numbers are removed. We try to use W, X, Y, and Z to point you to the exact area of the wiring schematic your peers want you to look at, to make sure that you are able to process that question quickly, accurately, without being disadvantaged. So Tim, we try to do our very best to make sure that diagrams are very simplified. They're almost leaning oftentimes on many of the tests towards training diagrams than diagrams that and diagrams you pull out of service information. So in the service information, all the diagrams are shown at rest. In training, sometimes they'll show them closed. In ASE's world, we try to show all diagrams at rest and then make you do the work of, like, I'm looking at the wiring schematic and service information. When this relay is energized, this contact closes, then current or voltage is applied to this particular part of the circuit. So.
All right, why don't we go ahead and move on? So with the insight we've seen from multiple points of view, the tricky questions part doesn't pan out, and that is also a myth. Okay, so let's take a guess maybe a few more minutes here to do some follow-up questions. I know we have them ranging from all over the place.
So John asked an interesting question about brand disadvantage prevention. So what he's asking there is, I would assume, how do we avoid discriminating against someone, a manufacturer or a specific manufacturer? The workshop committee has to take all of that into consideration. Not only, you know, when they're reading the question, is the question got just one correct answer, but how will candidates that from this manufacturer or that manufacturer or this discipline be able to manage this question? So the biggest, a good description of that is oftentimes we hear that the questions are sometimes manufacturer specific. Oh, this is a GM test. Oh, this is an import test. Oh, this is a Toyota test. That's not the case. Some of the questions are derived from that content. My example of the Toyota mirror circuit, there's an item on one of the tests that has inspiration from the Ford push button keyless entry, but you're pushing key buttons, I guess, on the Ford. And the reason that question was written by someone not from Ford, but by a person from another manufacturer seeking a way to ask a question about that can analyze or assess a technician's understanding of how diodes function in a circuit. So that's very that's a way that sometimes you'll see a question that leans towards a manufacturer. It's not how the system, it's not the manufacturer's specific description of operation that's being tested. It's not how it's applied in the vehicle. It's the schematic or the in the components in the schematic and how they function. So that's really the importance there and how that gets managed. We also pay real close attention because of if a manufacturer says my guys aren't going to get this, those questions are then rehashed if possible and when we try to save them, or they're then shelved and not used. So thank you.
Don, anything else from over in your way?
No, Dave, I don't have anything right at the moment. Thanks.
All right, well, let's go ahead and wrap this up. So tonight we've talked about a number of different myths that we've debunked, but one fact for sure is that the ASE certification schedule is what you see on your screen. The summer registration is going on now through August 25th. And once you register, you have 90 days to schedule a testing appointment. And this marks the 5th year that ASE has been doing computer-based testing, with computer-based testing now available throughout the year. I just want to say thank you to everyone for joining us tonight, taking time out of your precious schedule. And on behalf of Don Dew and Dan Baumhart, thanks very much, and we hope to see you at another ASE webinar soon. Thank you.